No institution other than the Supreme Court is asked to explain itself through written opinions, blah, 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 on and on and on. When you're ready, you may begin.
Former U.S. President William Howard Taft said in his book, "Our Chief Magistrate and His Powers, President come and go, but the Supreme Court goes on forever. Over time, the courts have gained power through their decisions, setting precedents for future courts, whereas a president's policies primarily affect the time period of their administration." The Supreme Court and lower courts have gradually shaped the nation's future through their rulings, legislating from the bench and acting as political players to further their political views on the Constitution.
We agree with Professor Hopper's statement that the court's decisions can dramatically affect the nation's political fate. The rulings in the cases of McCutcheon v. FEC and National Federation of Independent Business v. Sebelius reveal the political impacts that court rulings had on the nation. Last month, the Nevada Supreme Court affected the political fate for termed-out city council members, prohibiting them to run for mayor in the case of Lorton v. Reno City Clerk, opening the door for 20 candidates to fill the vacancies.
Justice Joseph Story wrote in 1836, "The danger is that the judges will be ready to yield themselves to the passion, politics, and prejudices of the day." The words of Justice Story can be seen with President Franklin Roosevelt, who tried to influence the courts to approve his New Deal programs by turning to Congress to pack the courts in his favor. Under pressure, the courts began ruling in favor of New Deal legislation, such as the case West Coast Hotels v. Parrish, which upheld the constitutionality of the minimum wage law.
Congress can limit the oversight of the Supreme Court through the process of jurisdiction stripping, limiting what the judicial branch can review in the legislative and executive branches. Despite the stripping of the Immigration Responsibility Act in 1996 to reduce the impact of the courts, the caseloads of the U.S. Court of Appeals actually increased by 18%.
Congress can enact legislation or propose constitutional amendments to maneuver around the rulings of the Supreme Court. In U.S. v. Lopez, Congress rewrote the Gun-Free School Zones Act and added a provision to Title 18 of the United States Code, stating that firearms affect interstate commerce. The 11th, 13th, 14th, 16th, 19th, and 26th Amendments have come as reactions to Supreme Court decisions. As reactions to the Supreme Court's rulings in United States v. FEC, senators such as Jon Tester and Bernie Sanders, who have proposed constitutional amendments to effectively overturn the court's decision.
In Federalist 78, Alexander Hamilton wrote that the judiciary has no influence over either the sword or the purse, and can take no active resolution. It may truly be said to have neither force nor will. We agree with Alexander Hamilton and advocate that the Supreme Court does not need any additional checks and balances because of the court's ability to check itself. The court repealed the decision in the 1940 Minersville School District v. Gobitis, which forced Jehovah's Witnesses to salute the flag at school, and was overturned 3 years later in West Virginia Board of Education v. Barnett through the dissenting opinion of Minersville because of the witnesses' right to free exercise of religion.
In a 2013 speech to a California conference, Justice Anthony Kennedy stated, "We're the only branch of government that gives reasons for what we do. Written opinions are important to the functioning of a democratic society because they ensure that precedent is upheld and consistently administered in a court of law. Without stare decisis, courts would be able to establish rulings without upholding and reviewing prior precedents to rule on court cases." William Blackstone used written opinions of the British Circuit Courts in his book Commentary on Law.
Historian Gordon Wood said, "I do not know of any country in the world where judges wield as much power in shaping the contours in life as they do in the United States. Since John Roberts became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, 22% of cases heard by the Supreme Court have ended in 5-4 decisions, illustrating the division within our courts. However, through written opinions, judges can protect that minority and add to the functioning of a democratic society." Thank you.
409. Okay, Martha, you want to start?
Yeah. What is judicial review and how have the courts used this power to develop public policy?
Judicial review is able to interpret laws passed, the constitutionality of them. As you can see in Marbury v. Madison, one of the first cases with judicial review, the courts gave themselves the power through John Marshall to interpret the Constitution to their means.
I'd like to disagree with Clark and say that judicial review has existed way before Marbury v. Madison. We adopted the law from the British parliamentary system, and also you can see in the court case Houghton v. United States, Congress reviewed the constitutionality, or the Supreme Court reviewed the constitutionalities as Congress proposed a direct tax on carriages, and the Supreme Court argued that that went against the direct tax clause of the United States, using judicial review before Marbury v. Madison.
What are the methods used to interpret the Constitution, and which do you prefer?
Clarence Thomas used an originalist way to interpret the Constitution, stating that every single amendment was passed literal, verbatim, and it should not change at all. And he has written a dissent on every single case that he has sat on, which sets up the president to have an originalist panel take over and rule just on his dissenting opinions. And I personally prefer a contextualist view.
However, recently Justice Anthony Kennedy just brought up a new way to review the Constitution by just reviewing it said by human dignity, and that we should just do it by the passions of what the humans need and through the own personal dignity of the Supreme Court justices.
In your opinions, when the Supreme Court provides an opinion in whatever case, have they ever created law through legislation by their opinions?
The Supreme Court has created law through their decisions in Brown v. Board of Education, where they desegregated school zones, and then in Brown 2, where they reheard the case and made the sanctions against the states that didn't desegregate more strict and more severe, and upheld the constitutionality of desegregating.
Is that creating law, or is that interpretation of law?
It would be creating law because they, in a prior case, in Dred Scott, it was separate but equal, but they created a law by desegregating and stripping the Jim Crow laws out of the states.
Anyone down there?
Does judicial review violate the principle of the rule of law?
Judicial review doesn't violate the concept of rule of law, because rule of law is stating that no person is above the law, and in an in-camera inspection, President Nixon was found that his tapes in Watergate were not a matter of national security, and they could be heard in the investigation in Watergate and led to his impeachment.
However, if you looked at an anti-federalist point of view on it in C.N. Brutus 78, he stated that there's no power above the Supreme Courts to enforce their decisions, which could potentially be violating the rule of law because there's no one potentially above than the Supreme Court that can do so.
What are the advantages and disadvantages of having judges appointed, not elected, to serve?
I think that there's extreme disadvantages with that. I think that judges should be elected by the people to create more of a democratic society, because judges' decisions majorly impact the people of the United States. So they should be picked by the judges instead of just appointed by the presidents, because the presidents very rarely talk about what they're going to do and who they're going to appoint to the Supreme Court.
Well, you said picked by the judges?
Or picked by the president, or appointed by the president, so that's what I meant.
However, an advantage would be that elections would increase the partisanship within the judges, so it would prevent them from being able to rule in a more liberal way on one thing and a more conservative way on another thing, which is what Justice Anthony Kennedy does.
I would disagree that the judges are actually appointed by the people, because they elect the president, and then the president has to have his appointments approved by the Senate Committee, which is also elected by the people. So in a sense, not directly elected by the people, but they actually are, because they pick the people that are electing them.
Should they, Supreme Court justices, should we continue to give them a lifetime appointment?
We should, because they're politically isolated with a lifetime appointment. Because Justice Earl Warren, he was appointed by a Republican president, and since he had a lifetime appointment, he started to drift more towards a democratic thought on civil rights. And if he was just appointed for a term during that president, he might have lost his appointmentship, because the president would have wanted to appoint someone else more Republican.
And as you can see in Hungary, they reduced the the age limit for their justices from being able to serve until they were 70 to forcing them to retire when they were 62 years old, and that really hurt their judicial system because it decreased the people's amount of institutional knowledge.
However, our society is ever changing, and if you can see that if we keep judges who have been on the Supreme Court for a very long time, their opinions might be a little bit outdated and is not as kept up with the current modern society, and that might affect decisions.
How did judicial review evolve even though it's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution?
One of the first times that there was judicial review was Chisholm v. Georgia, which was judicial review on interstate commerce. And it's evolved over time because there's more and more rulings that strike down laws that are unconstitutional, whereas it was originally just put in place to check Congress.
However, recently the Supreme Court has been very reluctant in using judicial review because there's been very heavily controversial Supreme Court cases, for example, Citizens v. United v. FEC, which said that the government can't restrict political expenditures from private corporations and labor unions, and this got heavy use of the media because it was credited toward creating super PACs and etc. So they're being very reluctant in using judicial review.
Okay, time. Martha?
Okay, actually I thought you seem to be the lead on almost every cross.
Well, generally we have Henry, and he, like me and him, do